The next review on economics is titled Understanding Business Cycles. So what we've seen is that world GDP and GDP for most countries over the last 20, 30, 50, 100 years has increased. So 50 years back we were here, now we're definitely at a higher level. That is, the real GDP has increased, or we are producing more than what we were many years back. However, this increase hasn't been in this straight line. There have been periods of high growth. There have been periods of growth but slow growth. There have been periods of even decline from previous levels. And then growth again, so on and so forth. So we've seen that GDP has increased, but it hasn't increased in a straight line fashion. It has increased in cycles. So a business cycle is characterized by fluctuations in economic activity. So the real GDP, the rate of unemployment are the key variables that determine a particular phase and cycle. That is, in an expansion, generally the real GDP is increasing. So this will be an expansion. During the peak, the real GDP growth stops and begins decreasing. So it's still growing, but the growth rate has decreasing. During a contraction or a recession, the real GDP is declining from previous levels. And through a trough, the decline stops and it starts increasing again from the previous levels. So this is, you can say, time on the x-axis and the GDP is on the y-axis. So there's an expansion, peak, contraction or recession, and a trough. Now, none of the economists disagree with cycles. It's visible. Everybody can see cycles. All economists, all policymakers, governments, individuals experience and live in business cycles. We all live in cycles. That is, there are times when people are employed very well. There are times, bad times, when people are unemployed. Times when GDP growth is good. Times when GDP growth is bad. Different economists, however, give different reasons as to why these cycles occur, or as to why GDP doesn't grow in a straight line. Why do we have these phases of high growth and phases of low growth or negative growth? Now, generally speaking, the reasons we'll study in a few slides, but let's just understand what are the features of each of these phases. So an expansion features growth in most sectors, increasing employment, increasing consumer spending, and increasing investment. So the CIGX generally is positive. So demand is increasing, employment is increasing. As it approaches its peak, the rate of increase of each of these factors, they are growing, but the rate of that growth starts to declining. So if they were growing by 10%, they now start to grow by only 5%, or they start to grow by only 3%. They're still growing, but the expansion is approaching its peak. That is, this growth rate is not as strong. A contraction or a recession is when there is decline in most sectors. So consumption starts to decline, investment start to decline, so on and so forth. And at a trough, again, most of these things bottom out and start improving. Please note that business cycles have seen to recur. That is, they occur again and again, not at regular intervals. So the timing is not certain. How big will a contraction or a trough be? It doesn't have to be a perfect semicircle every time. So the timing varies, the length varies. However, we've seen that these troughs and expansions do seem to recur. Now, what we've seen is that about 3 key activities that we must monitor. So we've seen that the inventory ratio or the inventory at business level gives us a good indication of where we are in the cycle. Rather, the inventory to sales ratio is also monitored to understand the business cycle. So what happens is that generally firms don't want to keep too much inventory because it's a cost, it's a storage cost. They don't want to keep too little inventory because they don't want to run out of stock. If the customer demands it, you want to be able to have enough inventory to meet the demand, but also not incur wasteful expenditure in storage costs. So now in steady times or during steady economic growth, the inventory to sales ratio tends to a normal level, and that normal level varies for different industries. We'll study it better in financial reporting or when we study financial management. But every industry has some level of inventory that they need to maintain to service their clients. What we see is that when an expansion is approaching its peak, that is, sales growth is beginning to slow, what will happen to inventory levels? They will start to pile up. Why? Because economic growth was steady, so you were producing inventory with the hope that you will be able to sell it, or with the hope of a regular sales growth that you have been witnessing all this while. You were projecting a similar sales growth in the coming times and you were replenishing your inventory. But suddenly you see that sales growth has slowed. Sales may still be growing, but they are not growing at the same level. So what your inventory planning was, or the way you were keeping your inventory, will probably now seem excessive because sales growth is not as strong, or the items are not taken out of the shelf as fast as you were anticipating. This is what is going to happen when an expansion is approaching its peak. So the inventory to sales ratio will be above its normal level generally when we see an expansion approaching its peak, or an expansion about to become a contraction or a recession. Now, the opposite will occur when a contraction reaches its trough. So once firms see these inventory levels very high, what will they do? They will stop production because they want to first clear out the inventory that is a cost to them or that is sitting in their godowns. So once they stop production or decrease production, we see real GDP growth slowing down or real GDP even declining, and this is how a subsequent contraction happens in the next period. Of course, once the production levels have been adjusted down, when the economy starts to recover, what will the firms see? Will the firms fall short of inventory, or will they have excess inventory once the economy starts recovering after a contraction? They will see that they're falling short of inventory because now they're not keeping as much inventory. They have normalized their business to this lower level of sales in the contraction, and suddenly economic growth is picking up. So the inventory to sales ratio is going down when a contraction is reaching its trough or when the economy is bottoming out. So generally, if we see the inventory to sales ratio going down, it may signal the end of a recession. So sales are increasing, your inventories are still low. When this ratio is high, it means probably the end of an expansion because sales are reducing and inventory is high. So all we're trying to explain is that there are certain things that as economists or as financial analysts you should keep track of when you're trying to track the state of the economy or even the state of a business. So resource use or inventory to sales ratio is one such ratio that you should track. Now, unemployment may not be a very good measure all the time. So in the last few sessions, we've linked GDP growth with unemployment, particularly that we say that when GDP growth is high, everybody's fully employed. When GDP growth is low, people are unemployed, or unemployed means we are below full potential. What we've seen actually in the real world is that people don't hire and fire employees that suddenly, or just because of a slight contraction or because of a slight expansion. So generally, you will let go employees as a last resort. You would first try to accommodate them in some other businesses, or try to cut extra shifts, try to keep everybody, but maybe even wages are seem to be sticky. You don't cut salaries, but you first don't replace staff if somebody's quitting, so on and so forth. Okay, I mean, everybody's experienced that, and that's the logical thing that everyone does. So a lot of times employment levels may still be high, and you may feel that the GDP is good, but employment is high because people are just not letting go, not because sales is not dropping or not because the economy is slowing down. Similarly, plant and machinery or capacity utilization or investment in plant and machinery may not be a very good barometer at times, because people will not increase plant and machinery or just shut down their entire plant and machinery at the first sign of a slowdown. They will again first try to adjust production. They will, if they want to increase, they will first use the existing capacity and try to maximize it. So all we're trying to say is that to measure the state of the GDP, measuring things like the inventory to sales ratio or housing sector activity, as we'll study in the coming slides, may be good parameters than just looking at utilization levels or investment in plant and machinery or unemployment levels, because these things tend to be a bit sticky. They don't fluctuate in tandem with the economy. There can be a lead or lag. Of course, if there's a prolonged slowdown, you will have to let go employees. You will have to shut down your plants. But for 6 months, even years, you can make do by adjusting other aspects of your business rather than letting employees go or shutting down your plant and machinery. Shutting down plant and machinery again would mean letting go employees. Housing sector activity is also very keenly tracked by economists or as financial analysts, because typically anything you buy or anything you consume, more or less or in some way or the other, ends up in a house. So if you buy furniture, if you buy a television, if you buy most consumer durable items, they will end up in your house. If housing activity is good in an economy, generally economies are seen to be doing well, because if you have a new house, it will not be an empty house, right? If people are buying newer houses, that means they will buy other things in the economy also. So governments in many parts of the world try to push housing or give SOPs for housing, especially for the end users. Of course, if it is speculative, it is at times bad, but especially for end users, if housing is growing, it's generally a good barometer of good economic growth. So important determinants of activity in the housing sector is first mortgage rates. We've generally seen that lower mortgage rates tend to increase home buying and higher interest rates tend to reduce home buying. It's logical, I don't need to explain it much. Housing costs are important. So if house prices go up too high, then we've seen that housing activity slows down, or people are, of course, speculative demand sometimes goes up, but for the end user or for the volumes of housing, if housing costs relative to your income go up, then economic or housing activity is seen to slow down. Whereas if housing costs relative to your income go down, so housing costs may go up, but if your incomes go up more than that, then that's good enough. Your volumes will pick up or housing activity will pick up. Speculative activity is also very important. Generally, rising home prices lead to more construction and excessive building because people want to capture the higher prices, so speculative demand for housing increases. And this also causes business cycles, because if there's high speculative activity, then when prices start to fall, there's dramatic decrease in housing activity and in new construction, etc., because there's so much extra stock that was created because of speculative demand. So housing sector activity is also tracked. And finally, demographic factors also influence housing sector activity a lot. So if the population of the country is between 25 to 40 years old, we've generally seen that augurs well for economic activity, because these are the individuals who will start a family, who will have children. They'll need new housing units in any economy. And finally, governments or policymakers want to track external trade. That is, what is our export relative to import? And we've studied this earlier. Generally, if domestic GDP growth is good, it means our imports will be high. If domestic GDP growth is poor, our imports will be low. So if we are a rich country, then we can buy more. But if we are poor ourselves in a particular period, then we will not buy as much. Of course, it is also dependent on the currency movements. If our currency appreciates, we import more because foreign goods become cheaper for us. If our currency depreciates, we import less because foreign goods become more expensive. So domestic GDP and currency generally has an impact on external trade, which is also monitored by economists because net exports are also an important determinant of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is also the GDP. So housing sector activity for consumption, inventory to sales ratio for investments, and external trade for the net exports is what we want to track as economists. Government purchases we've generally seen are independent. So consumption demand, investment demand, external trade is what we have basically tried to measure by these three indicators that we studied. The inventory ratio, the inventory to sales ratio, the housing sector activity to understand consumption, and the external trade activity to understand our net exports. A typical business cycle can be characterized by the following. So in a trough, GDP growth rate changes from negative to positive. We are in a trough. Unemployment is at its highest. Increasing use of overtime and temporary workers. So employment is increasing. We had let go many people, but now we are at the trough. So we start hiring more. That is, we start at least making our people work overtime and at least start hiring temporary workers because we're still not very confident. So we don't want to hire people on our rolls because we're still not confident of a recovery, but at least contract workers start increasing, overtime work starts increasing. Spending on consumer durable and housing may start increasing during the trough. And we see some inflation coming back. During an expansion, GDP growth rate is seen to increase. Unemployment rate decreases as hiring accelerates. Investment increases. More equipment is purchased, more capital is purchased, home construction is high. Inflation may increase during this stage. And imports also start increasing as domestic income growth accelerates. During the peak, the growth rate will start to decrease. Unemployment will still be decreasing, but hiring will start slowing down. So you're still hiring, you're not laying off people. But if you were hiring 100 people last quarter, you're now hiring only 10 more people. So hiring is still increasing. Unemployment rate is decreasing, but it's slowing down. We are reaching the peak. Consumer spending and business investment will grow but at a slower rate, and inflation will also start increasing. This will finally culminate into a contraction or recession. Please note these timelines are not fixed. Each of these periods can last from 1 year to 10 years. But when a contraction, and calling the turn is much tougher than just the way I'm explaining it. Okay, if it was as easy for me to call these things, I probably wouldn't be here doing this. So it's very tough for you to pick the points in the economy. So you have to be a very smart person to be able to do that. But as far as what we've seen in hindsight is that this is what happens, that inflation rate increases. In a contraction or recession, GDP growth is negative. Hours worked decreases. Unemployment rate increases. Spending, home construction, business construction, everything decreases. Economy is now slowing down. We are in a recession. Inflation rate decreases, but after a lag. So after a little while, we'll see even demand slows down. So demand slows down, inflation also starts coming off. That is, prices don't increase as much. Inflation is the year-on-year increase in the price. So there is no more increase in the prices because demand is slowing down. Imports will decrease because domestic income growth is slowing down. So these are the characteristics of the 4 business cycles. We'll study more as to what are the theories or what do different economists say as to why these business cycles occur. Now, the neoclassical economists said that business cycles, that is, these temporary increases in GDP growth rate, declines in GDP growth rate, occur primarily because of changes in technology over time. And the neoclassical economists concur with the theory that what we have been demonstrating in our graphs, that the economy has a strong tendency to pull back to full potential GDP or full employment level. A recession will put downward pressure on money or on wage rates such that supply will adjust and economy will come back to full potential GDP. If people are overemployed, then that will put upward pressure on the wage rate, and again supply curve will shift to the left and economy will come back to full potential GDP. So they conclude that these cycles only result in temporary deviations from long run equilibrium. Long run equilibrium keeps increasing as technology keeps becoming better. But the temporary fluctuations along the long run aggregate supply or along this full potential GDP, which keeps increasing, so GDP level keeps going up as technology improves. But in the short run, people are overemployed or underemployed, which is what creates these cycles, and these cycles are mainly a result of short-term fluctuations, and wage rates correct so that the employee comes back or the employment comes back to the full potential level, or the GDP comes back to the full potential level. So wages correct such that the economy is at full potential GDP at any point in time. Cycles are only temporary fluctuations. Increase in GDP happens because of increase in technology or betterment of technology over time. The Great Depression of the 1930s, we learned that this wage correction theory of the neoclassical economists, and also the theory that I have been teaching hitherto, does not really hold true or does not work. That is, wages tend to be sticky. Wages don't go down or don't go up, or they definitely don't go down and go up as fast as what we have been demonstrating in our previous explanations, or what the neoclassical school economists said. So the Keynesian economists, named after the British economist John Maynard Keynes, believed that there are these shifts in aggregate demand due to expectations of business owners. So first of all, there are these temporary increases in GDP because entrepreneurs are human beings and individuals. They become too optimistic at times and they invest more, they start producing more in the hope that demand will keep increasing. But then they realize that things are not so good and they are stuck with inventory, so they have to stop production, they have to stop investment, during which phase GDP growth slows down or GDP can even decline. So the Keynesian economists said that cycles or these fluctuations occur because of the level of optimism of entrepreneurs or the people who run the businesses. Overproduce and overinvest when they're too optimistic about the growth potential, and then they realize things are not good, so they underproduce or underinvest, and this is the period where GDP slows or GDP growth becomes negative, when they're too pessimistic. The Keynesian economists, however, also added the assumption that wage rates don't adjust as quickly as what the neo-classical economists said. So their prescription or their policy prescription during times of recession to bring the economy back to full potential GDP is that do not wait for wages to correct. What we have said is that don't have to worry about it. Even if economy is below full potential GDP, people are unemployed, so wages will correct and economy will automatically come back to the full potential GDP, but that does not happen so fast. Wages don't correct so fast, they remain downward sticky. People we saw in 1930s remain unemployed for years together, which can cause a lot of social unrest. So the Keynesian economists said that do not wait for the GDP to correct. Do not wait for the wage rates to fall down or correct. They said that you should stimulate the economy because wages are downward sticky. So to stimulate the economy or to move it back to the full potential GDP, you should provide monetary and fiscal stimulus. That is, you should help boost aggregate demand by cutting interest rates or by reducing tax rates, doing more government spending, because that is a better way to boost employment in the short run and bring the economy back to full potential GDP than waiting for the wage rates to correct on their own. The new Keynesian school believed with all that the Keynesian economists are saying that yes, it's the optimism of entrepreneurs, wages are sticky, but they said that it's not just wages. Even the price of other productive inputs are also downward sticky. That is, even commodity prices, natural resource prices don't correct as fast even though demand may be low. So because these input prices tend to be downward sticky, supply will not go up or supply will not shift to the right unless you take some measures on your own, or even if it moves to the right, it will take too long because wages don't correct as fast. For the supply curve to shift to the right and the economy to come back to the full potential GDP, you need input costs to correct, you need wages to correct, you need other input costs to correct. They say that these costs don't correct as fast. So to bring the economy back to full potential GDP, you need to provide fiscal and monetary stimulus, that is, stimulate demand. So there was a neoclassical theory, the Keynesian theory, the new Keynesian theory, which is the same as the Keynesian theory, but it says that it's not just wages, also other inputs that are downward sticky. The monetarist school said that the variations in aggregate demand or the business cycles actually happen because of the intervention by the central bank. So central banks intervene too much in the economy. There are times when they increase money supply too much, and then there are times that they reduce money supply, and the central banks should maintain a steady growth of money supply. If they don't, if they randomly or rather keep increasing or decreasing money supply at different points in time, then that can cause business cycles or economic cycles. So monetarists blame the inappropriate decision by monetary authorities for recessions and peaks or for business cycles. So they say that the central bank should keep a steady and predictable increase in money supply rather than unpredictable or random increases in money supply. So they blame the central banks for causing business cycles. The Austrian school believes that business cycles are caused by government intervention. So policymakers sometimes spend too much money, bring in too much liquidity into the system, force interest rates down to artificially low levels, when firms end up investing too much capital and even become speculative because money is available so cheap. Then they do the other way around as well. So the monetarist school blamed the central banks and the monetary authorities. The Austrian school blames the government for business cycles. That it is the bad policies of the governments that have seen to have caused business cycles that at times make people invest more and cause expansions, and then people underinvest and cause recessions. The last school that we are going to study is called the New Classical School, which introduced the real business cycle theory, which said that changes in growth rates happen because of changes in technology and external shocks as opposed to monetary or government policies. So they said that there are periods in our life or in a country's life when new technology is discovered. And when new technologies are discovered, those years or those times will see very high economic growth. And then there are periods when new technology is not discovered or we don't improve productivity. So because of that, there are times of low economic growth or even no economic growth. Similarly, there can be external shocks, there can be natural disasters, there can be discoveries of oil, there can be discoveries of natural resources, because of which GDP growth may accelerate or decelerate. So the new classical economists said that policymakers should not try to counteract business cycles. That is, don't give fiscal stimulus, don't give monetary stimulus, it's not needed. Business cycles are a natural phenomena. They are a phenomena because of technology discovery, external discoveries, external shocks, natural disasters, finding of new resources, etc., which are bound to happen, and the economy will adjust accordingly. So you don't need to intervene to try to stop this phenomena, because it will always happen. Technology discovery is not in the government's hands. It's not in the central bank's hands. So their efforts are not going to change business cycles. So these were the 5 essential theories that we studied. The neoclassical, that said that business cycles happen because of changes in technology over time. Temporary deviations will be adjusted by wages. So wages will adjust so that the economy comes back to full potential, GDP. Keynesian school says it's because of the level of optimism of entrepreneurs that business cycles happen and wages tend to be sticky. New Keynesian said yes, it is the level of optimism that causes cycles, but not just wages, other input costs also tend to be sticky. Monetarists blame the central banks or the monetary authorities. Austrian school blames the government policies. And the new classical school says that it's because of discoveries in technologies and external shocks that business cycles happen. So governments don't need to intervene. Now, 2 very common terms that we've been using throughout our review. First is unemployment and second is inflation. So we'll study in more detail as to what we exactly mean by unemployment and how is it measured. So unemployment is when a person who is willing and able to work is not employed or cannot find a job. In general, there are 3 types of unemployment in an economy. Now, frictional unemployment will always remain in any economy. It's not a problem. It is the time lag necessary to match employees who seek work with employers who need their skills. So you need some time to interview the person. You need some time before you can decide, before you give him a letter or before you decide who to hire. So for a few months, a person may be unemployed, and if you may be switching a job, you may have found a new job. So while you're transitioning from one job to another job, you may have a couple of months off or a couple of months in which you don't have any work. That kind of unemployment is not a problem. It is just called frictional employment. It always remains in any economy as employers expand or contract and workers are fired or they quit to seek other opportunities. Structural unemployment is also not a problem. This is the unemployment because of the long run changes in technology or economies that eliminates some jobs while generating others for which unemployed workers need to acquire newer skills. So as more machination is happening or more automation is happening in the world, so many clerical jobs are not needed. We don't need as many secretaries because we have Outlook. We have a lot of things in which people can manage their calendars or their schedules themselves on their own. We don't need typists as many as were needed back in the day. So there are certain jobs that are getting eliminated in an economy because of structural reasons, because we have a structurally better alternative. So it's also not a problem. It just means that the employees need to acquire the skills that are more relevant to today's economy so that they can be employed in today's economy. Now, cyclical unemployment is what the policymakers generally try to target and address. So this is caused by the changes in the level of economic activity. So cyclical unemployment is high when we are less than full potential GDP, and it can even be negative if we are above the full potential GDP. That is, people are overemployed. So they are temporarily working even on the weekends, or they are temporarily working more hours a day than normal. So cyclical unemployment is the unemployment that we have been discussing hitherto, or is the employment that we've been talking about when we say that economy is not at full potential GDP. Now, a person who is not working will be considered to be unemployed only if he is actively searching for work. One who has been seeking work unsuccessfully for several months will be referred to as long-term unemployed. Now, unemployment rate is the percentage of people who are unemployed, that is, the unemployed people divided by the total labor force. And how is labor force defined? A numerical may come on this, okay? I don't have a numerical in my presentation, but this calculation may be tested in a numerical, so please understand it well. And if extra information is given, you have to again know enough to not include that extra information in your calculations. So labor force is all people who are either employed or unemployed. That is, all people who are looking for a job. People who choose not to be in the labor force are said to be voluntarily unemployed and are not included in the calculation of the unemployment rate. So if my mother does not want to work, it's her choice. She will not be called unemployed, or she will be called voluntarily unemployed. She will not come in the full potential GDP calculation. She will not come in the unemployment calculation. A person who is employed part-time but would prefer to work full-time, or is employed at a low-paying job despite being qualified for a significantly higher-paying one, is said to be underemployed. So I would consider myself underemployed, but that's okay. A lot of us would. The participation ratio, also referred as labor force participation, important guys, another important term you should be aware of. So it's the percentage of the working age population who are either employed or actively seeking employment. So people above 16 who are not in institutions are said to be the labor force. How many of them are looking for jobs or are already employed will be called the participation, or will be the labor force participation. So labor force participation ratio is people who are either employed or unemployed, that is actively seeking employment, divided by the total number of people above 16 not in institutions. Discouraged workers is also a problem. That is, short-term fluctuations in the participation ratio can occur because people are discouraged. They're discouraged, so they're not looking for jobs. So probably if the morale was better, if the economy was better, they would have looked for jobs. But right now they are discouraged, so they are not looking for jobs. So who are available for work but are neither employed nor are actively seeking employment. So again, this also is something that the government would want to address. That is, create enough opportunities so people think that they can be employed and they go and start looking for jobs. So that's how unemployment is defined. I don't have a numerical on it, but any of these data can be given in a question. You may be asked to calculate the labor force participation rate. You may be asked to calculate the unemployment rate, so on and so forth. So try to find some questions and do a few of these calculations, and we'll also try to provide you a quiz or some questions on this. Another important term, and we'll study in more detail, is referred to as inflation. So we've defined this before, but we'll define it again. Inflation is a persistent increase in the price level over time. Now, generally speaking, when we say the economy is in inflation, or there is inflation in the economy, then the prices of most goods and services are seen to be increasing. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of a currency. That is, $100 won't be able to buy you as much tomorrow as they are today if inflation is present. That is, $100 will be worth less tomorrow than today, because the $100 will be able to buy you less in the future than they are today. Inflation is essentially the decline in the value of money. The inflation rate is the percentage increase in the price level typically compared to the prior year, and monetary policy is often dependent on inflation rate, as we'll study in the next review on monetary and fiscal policy. Disinflation refers to negative inflation or a persistently decreasing price level. This is also bad. Deflation is also bad and is commonly associated with very deep recessions or severe recessions, is when prices of goods actually start going down because there's no demand or because people don't want to consume. Deflation is a bigger problem than inflation generally, because if there is deflation, then people are seen to postpone their consumption decision. So if you know that tomorrow price is going to be lower, you will stop consuming today, or you'll start consuming less today, which is detrimental to the economy. It's detrimental to the C part of the CIGX. So generally, governments or central banks don't want disinflation in the economy. In many parts of the world today, we're in 2016, in Europe, in Japan, disinflation is actually becoming a problem. That is, the prices of goods are actually going down. So people are postponing their consumption decisions. Now, to calculate the inflation, we generally use a price index for the proxy of the price level. So the consumer price index is generally a good indicator, or in many countries in the world, we use the consumer price index as an indicator of inflation in the economy. So the CPI basket, or the goods included in the consumption price index, will generally mirror the average citizen's consumption pattern. So in developed countries, for instance, we see food as maybe 14% of the index. That is, an average citizen spends 14% of his income on food, spends 8% on his income of his income on energy, and spends 77% of his income on other factors: entertainment, education, medical, what have you, on the spending, movies, fashion, clothing, is the remaining 77% of the basket. So these are the goods that you will include when you are constructing a consumer price index. That is, if you're measuring inflation, you can't just measure the inflation of luxury cars and say the price of luxury cars have doubled, so inflation in the economy is 100%. It's not correct, because nobody consumes luxury cars. There's a very small, minuscule percentage of the population that consumes luxury car. If the price of bread goes up, price of eggs goes up, price of fuel goes up, then we will say there is inflation in the economy because that's what everyone consumes, or that's a representative consumption basket in the country. So please note, the consumption basket of every country will differ, first of all. So in developed countries, we've seen that food is a relatively lower part of the total consumption basket. In emerging markets, in poorer countries, we see that food articles are a very big part of the consumption basket. In India, for instance, 45% of the consumption basket is made of food. In the US, it'll be 20% or even less than 20% of the total consumption basket that comprises of food. So for instance, for an example, we have a consumption basket here of an average citizen, which has apparel, vehicles, used car, medical cares, alcoholic beverages, tobacco, medical care, transportation, as different parts. So when we calculate inflation, what we do is we calculate the price of this entire basket today, and then we calculate the price of this basket in the previous year, and then we see what is the percentage increase in the price of this entire basket over 1 year, and that will be the inflation in the economy. Would that be a sensible and good measure of inflation? Yes, that is what is referred to as consumer price index, and the value of that basket at any particular time is represented by the consumer price index, that is the price of the basket. And the change in the consumer price index is essentially the change in the price of that basket. So we'll do an example and understand this better. The CPI is calculated as the cost of the basket today with the cost of the basket in an earlier base period. And the base period or the beginning value is considered something like 100. That is the first time we calculated the cost of the basket, we gave it a number 100, so that every time when we calculate the price of a basket today, we can measure it relative to 100. We'll do it with an example and you'll understand it better. So the CPI is the cost of the basket at current prices divided by the cost of the basket as base period prices multiplied by 100, because 100 is the base value that we gave. We'll do an example and understand. So the following table shows the information for a simplified basket of goods. There's cheeseburgers, not a very healthy consumption basket. Movie tickets, of course, gasoline to travel to the movie theater, I'm guessing, and digital watches. So this is someone's consumption basket. So I hope this is an annual number. In a year, he consumes 200 cheeseburgers, 50 movie tickets, 300 gallons of gasoline, and he buys 100 digital watches. That's not the point, okay? We're not making a character judgment. We need to calculate the index, that is the price of these in the base period is given. The current price is also given. Calculate the change in the price index for this basket from the base period to the current period. You can use the formula. Try to attempt it once, and I'll do it for you in a bit. So we essentially need to calculate the change in the price of this basket, which gives us a sense of the inflation that this individual is facing in his life. So in the base period, how much money did he need to spend to buy all these items? $2.50 for a cheeseburger, $7 for 50 movie tickets, $450 for gasoline, and $1,200 for the watches. So he spent a total of $2,500. In the current period, the prices have changed such that he needs to spend a total of $2,900. Now there's many ways of calculating the inflation. If I do simply 2,900 minus 2,500 divided by 2,500, it will give me the same answer as the inflation calculation as is done with the help of the CPI. But generally, we calculate something called as a consumer price index. That is, the first time we did this calculation, we will call it a base number of 100. So if 2500 was 100, what would 2900 be? 2900 divided by 2500 into 100, or 100 by 2500 into 2900. That is, the price index would be 116. So the index is up 16%, or the inflation over this period is 16%. This you can verify will also give you 16%. So it is the percentage increase in the price of the consumption basket. Now, what we studied is an example of a Laspers index. So a Laspers index is when the basket remains exactly the same. That is a constant basket of goods and services. However, in the real world, does our basket needs to be constant? Do you think we are consuming today exactly the same as what we were consuming 10 years back, each of us? No, our consumption basket also keeps changing. So the next index that we'll study in a while is called the PASH index. So PASH index accommodates for a changing consumption basket as well. Now, before we do that, there's just one more concept that you need to understand, which is also important for a lot of economies, which is called the wholesale price index or the producer price index. So the CPI is the consumer price index. It's generally measured with retail prices of goods, because the consumption or the consumer is assumed to be buying from the retailer, that is the shop at the corner where he's buying most of his consumption basket from. A lot of times we also need to measure that what is the wholesale price of the same commodity. That is, when businesses are selling to other businesses or distributors out of the factory, what are the prices that they are charging, which is generally lower. The price level is lower at a wholesale level. So we want to see the percentage increase in price at a wholesale level. So which is measured using the producer price index or the wholesale price index. This is also reported for all major economies. So that we know that what is the increase in raw materials, what is the increase in intermediate good prices, or the wholesale prices of finished goods. So they also give some indication of the shifts in demand among industries. So we've also noticed in most economies that there are two commodities whose prices fluctuate a lot. First is food and second is energy, or you can say oil. These prices have seen to be particularly volatile. Why food? Because of seasons. Rains are good, sometimes there's a drought, sometimes fluctuating things happen, especially in today's world of global warming. These effects are more accentuated than ever. So food prices are seen to be very volatile. And similarly, energy prices are seen to be very volatile because, again, hurricanes or global tensions, political tensions, etc. cause changes in the price of oil because production is dependent on a few factors. So a lot of times we measure something called as core inflation. Core inflation is inflation excluding food and energy. Because food and energy can be so volatile, core inflation gives us a better sense of actually the demand side or the supply side of the things or of the monetary policy. So if core inflation is going up, then we can say that maybe the demand is actually going up, or the monetary policy is too lax, or there is excess money supply which is causing price to go up. So core inflation, remember, is inflation X of food and energy prices. Also an important parameter. Most economists in most countries will measure core inflation also and present it for analysis. Headline inflation is the inflation that we've just studied. So the inflation number that is reported is generally called the headline inflation, and we also measure something called as core inflation. So as discussed, we studied the Laspers index. Now, important to understand that the inflation measured using the Laspers index is generally overstated by about 1 to 2%. I don't remember this exact number, but as far as I can recall, it is overstated by about 1 to 2%. So if the inflation calculation that we did, generally, if the inflation number comes out to be 10%, for instance, then the actual inflation in the economy is only 8%. Or rather, the actual inflation is only about 9%, somewhere in the range. This happens because just because prices are going up doesn't necessarily mean inflation. Prices may be going up because the quality of products is going up. So it's possible that the cheeseburger now has better quality. It is more organic. It has more cheese in it, or it has more beef in it. So the price of the cheeseburger has gone up, but not because of inflation. It's because the quality of the product has improved. If the quality has improved, it's not inflation. It's just a better quality product. Secondly, newer goods keep coming into the consumption basket of people. And generally we've seen that newer products are cheaper than the older products. So our consumption basket, first of all, is not constant. Every year it keeps changing. And it changes towards cheaper products. So because we are keeping our consumption basket constant, we are ignoring this fact. Because we are assuming that the person has to consume exactly what he consumed last year. But actually speaking, in general, people change their consumption basket to slightly cheaper alternatives every year or as time progresses. So that factor also helps lower the inflation. Finally, there is substitution. That is, you are measuring the retail price. The retail price of a toothpaste may have gone up. But who's to say that people are still buying from the retail outlets, or they are not going to a Walmart, or they are not switching to cheaper online portals to buy their stuff? Because we are measuring retail prices at a corner of the shop whose real estate probably has gone up, and that's why he's charging higher for the convenience or for the toothpaste, doesn't mean that the economy actually is paying that higher retail price. People generally are also seen to substitute to cheaper alternatives of buying the same good. That is, people buy more from Walmart today, they buy more from online stores, they buy from cheaper alternatives. So the inflation actually is not as high as what is being calculated by the Laspers index. That is by just taking the same retail to retail price of the same commodity. So a technique known as hedonic pricing can be used to adjust the price index of product quality. So again, for adjusting or substitution, we use something called as the Fisher index. And the Fisher index is the geometric mean of the Laspers index and the Pasch index. So Pasch index uses the current consumption weights to calculate the inflation, not the original consumption basket. So the Pasch index will use today's consumption basket to compute the inflation rate. What you need to know is that the product quality effect that we first mentioned is adjusted or can be adjusted by a technique called hedonic prices. So this will bring down. So from 10% to get to that actual 8% level, we can do some adjustments to the inflation calculation so that we get to the actual number. Don't need to know the details of them. Just know that the Laspers index overstates inflation for the reasons we discussed. Quality can be better, the new goods coming into the consumption basket, and people can substitute to cheaper alternatives or cheaper means of buying the same goods. So for newer goods, we use the Pasch index that we'll study. That is, we use the current consumption basket to calculate inflation instead of the previous year's consumption basket. And the Fisher index uses an average of the Laspeyres value and the Pasch index value that we'll just see, again to adjust for this upward bias in the Laspeyres inflation. So please do the same calculation, but now using the Pasch index. So continuing the example we presented earlier, assume the basket of goods has changed as follows. So he's consuming more cheeseburgers, less movie tickets, less gasoline, and more digital watches. So again, calculate the inflation now using the current period. So please note, to calculate the Pasch index, we will use the current consumption basket. That is not 200, we'll use 205, not 50, we will use 45. Instead of 300, we'll use 295 gallons of gasoline. And instead of 100 digital watches, we'll now use 105 digital watches. So this should be 105, not 150. The calculation is correct. Into 12 will be 1260. So again, cost of the basket in the base period comes out to be 2530. And the cost of the basket in the current period comes out to be 2895. 2530 we called a number of 100. So 2895 we'll call 100 by 2530 into 2895, that is, it comes out to be 114.43. So the inflation now is lower, it's 14.43%. So this is what we've explained, that generally the Laspeyres index will overstate because consumption basket shift towards the cheaper goods is what we have seen. So Pasch index is the same calculation, but use the current consumption basket instead of the base period's consumption basket to calculate the inflation. We've studied cost push inflation already. Please watch the previous video and see how the dynamics pay out for cost push inflation. Please remember, this is because of a supply side shock. Most generally, it's seen because of wage inflation. In the example, I said a natural disaster. But when we've seen cost push inflation is because as wages go up, supply curves shift to the left, government stimulate demand, so aggregate demand goes up, causing the price level to go up. So it starts first with a supply shock, high wages, high input prices, natural disaster causing supply to shift to the left. Policy responds by stimulating demand. So aggregate demand goes up as banks cut interest rates, governments cut taxes, etc. Demand goes up, employment comes back to full potential, but price level has gone up from P0 to P2. Cost push inflation studied last time. Demand pull inflation again starts from the demand side. So we are at equilibrium, demand goes up. For the short run, we are above full potential GDP. Wages will increase until employment comes back to full potential GDP. Price level goes up from P0 to P2. So supply level, the initiation, the end result of both supply push inflation and demand pull inflation is the same. That price goes from P0 to P2 or a higher level. Doesn't have to be exactly the same. Economy stays at the same level of employment. However, a supply push inflation begins with a supply side shock. A demand pull inflation begins with a demand side shock or a demand side increase. Finally, we'll study about some economic indicators. In different economies, these indicators are different, but just know that leading indicators are indicators that move before that peak or trough before the business cycle has peaked or troughed. Coincident indicators are those that change direction at the same time as the economy. So they will peak or trough at the same time as the economy peaks or troughs. Stock markets are a very good example of leading indicators. They normally go up before the economy has recovered, and they go down before the economy has started to slow down or before the economy has troughed. Stock markets trough before the economy has troughed. So these are leading indicators. They are coincident indicators that change direction roughly at the same time. Housing permits are a good example, or rather actual housing construction is a good example of coincident. Lagging indicators don't change direction until after the economy has changed direction. So they will move up after the economy has already moved up. Unemployment is sometimes seen as a lagging indicator. Or it will go down after the economy has gone down, or unemployment will go up after the economy has gone up. So they change direction or they move after the economy has moved. So the classifications leading, coincident, lagging reflect the tendencies in the timing of the turning points, not the exact relationships with the business cycle. So how much will they change is not what we are talking about. We just mean that what we've seen is that these indicators also change their direction, that is positive to negative or negative to positive, as the economy changes direction from positive to negative or negative to positive. Will it exactly go up by so much percent when economy is in a recession, or will it go down by so much percent when the economy is in a expansion, is not what we are saying. It's just that these activities, for example, stock markets, building permits, industrial activity, unemployment, inflation, these are indicators which also change their direction if they are leading before, if they are coincident at the same time, if they are lagging after the economy has changed its direction. So you have to be a bit careful and a bit wary before you draw any conclusions by any one indicator, and you should normally look at many indicators before you try to do an analysis or before you try to make your investments or try to derive any conclusions. So as a homework, just try and research some leading, lagging and coincident indicators of an economy. They're available in most books, and if you can just do a Google search also, you'll get a good idea of some leading, lagging and coincident indicators. But of course, just we have to be wary that that is what has generally been seen. They're not always accurate, and we must use that, look at many indicators before we derive a conclusion. So that was about understanding business cycles, an important review, an interesting review. So try to go through it again, watch the video again, and try to grasp the concepts at your time. We'll start